Okay. So,
We are loading and we should be live in about 5 seconds. And all right, so welcome everyone. Good evening. We hope that your weekend turned out as you planned. You are tuned in to our fifth chapter of Collective Sessions, the Reparations Illinois chapter. So tonight we have a really special guest joining us all the way from Chicago. His name is Marvin Slaughter. We also have Aaliyah Sarfraz. You all know by now, she is also the co-host and co-creator for our movement in this chapter. Marvin, good evening. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for asking. So we started off with our very first interview was with Philip Rudock, the current mayor in Australia. Is it Hornsby, Australia?
yes.
I'm pronouncing it. And then we had Ali Kohan. He's Justice Ali Kohan from Pakistan. And then we had James Cannon, which is Nick Cannon's father, and Clifton Pearson, who is a host of Justice Chicago and a politician, but also he's on the ground. He's like, he likes to say he's from the sidewalk. You know, he ran a lot of clubs in Chicago and he knows a lot of people. He ran for alderman at some point as well. And so we had him, and then we had ex-senator, the former senator, I like to say ex, but the former senator and very still relevant to this day. We had Senator Boris. He was appointed Obama seat when Obama became president, and he had something to say about reparations. And then we had Ellen Jacoby, who is a casting director based out in Miami, Florida. She's casted Ali, the movie Ali, Bad Boys, Miami Vice, which is my mother. My mother was in that, but she's been in the business for a long time, and she had something to say, and she's Jewish. So it was interesting to have her take on reparations. Tonight, we also had, I'm missing one person. We had King Mahad Nadi. He tuned in live from Dakar, and he had something about reparations and repatriation as well. And he spoke, gave us a different perspective from Africa and what they would like to see. So tonight, here we are, we're having you. I reached out to your mentor, is it safe to say mentor? Mr. Sandy. Dr. Sandy, and he recommended you to speak on this topic. And we are delighted to have you here on the show tonight.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, appreciate that. So, I mean, could you tell us about your background? I see that you've studied Chicago University of Illinois at Chicago or for Chicago. And what is your major and how did you meet Dr. Sandy? How did you meet Dr. Sandy? And what led you to want to focus on reparations?
Yeah, sure. So I originally did my undergraduate studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago in political science and economics. I graduated in spring of 2019. And then I was accepted into the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, where I'm currently pursuing my master's in public policy. I originally got in contact with Dr. Darity after writing an article for the Chicago Policy Review that was based around his work in Road to Reparations. And he reached out and asked about my interest in the topic. And, I told him that I was involved in ADOS Chicago, and, he's very familiar with the ADOS movement. So, we began to work together on, some other pieces. And that's how Dr. Darity became my mentor.
Oh, that's wonderful. So tell us, in your research, what have you found, and what have you found? What would be something different that you could share with the world that we haven't already, thought of as far as reparations and how it would be funded? I mean, did you research and did you come up with anything, a simple solution to the funding process?
As far as a simple solution to the funding process, there isn't necessarily a simple solution. This isn't necessarily a simple problem, so it's going to take a complex solution. As far as what it's going to take to actually fund reparations, I guess we have to start with how much reparations are going to cost. And generally, Dr. Darity has shown that reparations should cost about 12 to 14 trillion dollars. There are other estimates, for example, by Larry Neal from the University of Illinois, that just looked at wages. And his research indicated that between the years 1620 and 1840, minus the cost of medical, food, and housing for the descendants of slaves in America, that they were owed $1.4 trillion. And if you use an interest rate of 5%, that total would be about 8.4 trillion today. So, when you start looking at a lot of these cost estimates, low ranges around 6 trillion, high ranges we've seen as high as, 100 trillion as far as reparations. So when it comes time to fund it, we have to figure out what exactly which metrics are we going to use to actually determine how much it's going to cost. Yeah.
I honestly believe that the cost is one of the major concerns. We spoke with the Honorable Philip Ruddock, who was very instrumental in the implementation of reparations when it came to Australia. But in Australia, it's a smaller scale of people that we're dealing with. When we pull the African descent of slavery here, there's a much larger number of people that could potentially be applying for reparations if we work through a commission. So for me, my main question to you tonight is, what does 40 acres and a mule mean to you?
Well, 40 acres and a mule to me is a lineage thing. If you trace my lineage back to, slavery plantations and the fact that my ancestors were offered a false promise of 40 acres and a mule, and then you look at how that impacts the intergenerational mobility of my family, you would see that my family would have been a lot more well off if we had received 40 acres and a mule, in addition to the other provisions that were in Sherman's order. So, 40 acres and a mule isn't just the monetary value, it's the opportunity to actually build a African-American community that isn't bought and sold by white funding dollars. It's more than just, having access to property, it's having access to an ability to decrease disparities in things like education and things like health. So when we talk about 40 acres and a mule, we want to talk about things like the racial wealth gap. We want to talk about how the racial wealth gap is tied back to the fact that we did not receive 40 acres and a mule. And also when we talk about the racial wealth gap, we have to be cognizant of the fact that it is tied directly to a lot of the different disparities that we see today. Things like police brutality, crime rates, healthcare, all of these different disparities that we see. If you start to address the fact that the African-American community is largely wealthless, you also start to impact those disparities and decrease them significantly.
Okay. I'm going to present to you an interesting view. We had a view last session, in fact. Ellen Jacoby, she's of the Hollywood, industry as a producer, as a director. She has dealt with an enormous amount of people. And she came on and she had to say that, look, as a Jewish person, I have gone through, this is my understanding, it's not quote for quote verbatim, but I did not suffer. My ancestors suffered. And she presented the view that she didn't feel that, slavery is a cause that we should be talking about in today's time. What would you say to that?
I would wholeheartedly disagree. The thing about slavery is that while the original sin of slavery might have been 400 years ago, the intergenerational aspect of those harms are just as prevalent today as the benefits. So if you have white slave owners that were compensated and they were allowed to pass down wealth generation after generation after generation, while my ancestors weren't allowed to accumulate or build, accumulate, or pass down wealth for generation after generation, then you are strategically putting, the African American community at a disadvantage in comparison to the white community. So that makes it an issue of today. And it is definitely evident when you look at the things that I, just previously mentioned: disparities in education, disparities in health. If you want to look at maternal mortality, these are things that can directly be traced back to the fact that we're largely wealthless.
Okay. And then you are in Chicago. I find that interesting. This is the land of the Lincoln. And, we're looking at reparations in the year of 2021, comparing it to 1601, I believe is the correct timeline. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, as you indicated, there's a huge amount of years and time that has come through, but a lot of people have different ideas and understandings of what reparations means to a specific person. In today's time, what do you feel reparations is?
Yeah, sure. I feel like reparations has to be highlighted by cash payments to individuals as a highlight for the program. Because if you're looking to alleviate many of the disparities that you see, it would mean that we would have to compensate the people who originally suffered the harm, and the descendants of those who originally suffered the harm. There is also, there's an economic theory called the Caldor-Hicks improvement, which basically means that if society as a whole was to benefit from a particular policy, even though it might harm a subsection of the policy, a subsection of the population, that we should implement the policy, but also compensate the subsection of people who will be harmed. Well, if we were to use that in today's terms, that would mean that American society benefited from slavery via, the wealth that was built from African Americans, to be startup capital for this nation, the intellectual property that was stolen from the African American community, et cetera, et cetera. So if we were the ones who are harmed, we should also be the ones who are compensated for the overall societal benefit that America reaped from our blood, sweat, and tears.
Okay. So in your article, you talk about how policymakers have dismissed it as being politically infeasible, as a fringe policy. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, inside of the African American community, I think reparations just now has hit like a approval rating of somewhere around 80 or 85%. So if you look at in our own community, the fact that, it's only 80 to 85%, and then you look at in the white community, I think it's somewhere around 20 to 30%. And unfortunately, we aren't the majority in the United States of America. So we do have to work with other groups. And that means that we have to make sure that we're making the case to other groups on why reparations is important. For a lot of policymakers, they don't happen to be African American, may not understand the struggle of African Americans. So it's kind of our job to elaborate more on it. And, as we saw with the social unrest during 2020 after George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, we can tie all of these issues back to the fact that African Americans are generally wealthless. We can tie this right back to the fact that, when you're in impoverished communities, those impoverished communities are more likely to have higher crime rates. They're also more likely to be over-policed. So if you can start to fix the wealth issue, you can also start to alleviate some of these other issues. And the thing about it being politically unfeasible is the fact that a lot of politicians, it might be a hard pitch for them to go back to their broadly white constituents and to say, you guys are on the hook to owe African Americans for a crime that you never committed. But one thing that myself and Dr. Darity believe is that this isn't a tax on whiteness. This is a debt that is owed by the American government for an original sin that the American government committed. It's not a tax on any white person who came here and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, however ridiculous that might sound. But this is not a tax on them. This is just simply saying that the American government owes the descendants of chattel slavery here.
Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Candace. I know Candace feels very much along the similar lines when it comes to did America commit an original sin? And I'd like her to elaborate on that for us tonight. Please, Candace.
Yeah, of course, America, I think that was America's original sin. And it's time for America to get right with God. It's time. This is a spiritual thing we're dealing with. And we see a lot of things happening, a lot of unrest in the community, climate change, climate problems. There's a lot going on. And I just think at this point that would be a good start in the eyes of God. If you're religious or whatever, however, if you call him Allah or whatever God you serve, now it's the time to get right with God. And maybe we would see things start going in a different direction in our world. I don't think anyone has put it that way before. But when you get to the core of who the African American people are, when you really are real and honest with the lineage of the African man and the African woman, biblical and in history times, then you would see that, you know, we are also dear to God's heart, very much so as any other ethnicity that's walking this earth. And the wrong that was done for years to another human, just a particular race. And we've had it done with the Chinese and the Jewish and the Indians, and they all have received some type of compensation or recompense or reparations for the horrible crime that was committed to their people. The only people that have not yet, but will be, paid is the Africans. And it's not a hard case to present to another human. It really isn't. I believe perhaps it's the way we might have been presenting it in the past. Maybe the language that we were presenting to the different politicians just was a little off-putting. Maybe we presented to them all of our hurt and we threw it down on the table, and it was like, wait, I don't want to hear, you gang banging over breakfast, you know what I mean? Just chill. I'll help you, but, just chill out. Like, some people just don't want to hear the tone in which we might have presented it and maybe the way that we said it. I think now is the time, because we have a lot of intellectual, younger millennials that are just coming out of college, fresh out of college, and are a little more clever or eloquent in the way they have been taught to present their case. It doesn't necessarily have to be screaming at someone else or being critical, So I think now we have learned our lesson, and now we're at the point where we have gotten the ear of the politicians, and they are putting together and researching how much. It's not in a way reparations will be funded and dispersed throughout the community. So that's what I think about that. Marvin, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I really like the part that you added, about, the religious nature of this. Even the Israelites during their exodus from Egypt received reparations from the Egyptians. If you look at Exodus 12 and 35, God told the Israelites to ask the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold on their way out. Unfortunately, African Americans didn't get our silver and gold on the way out, and that debt is still owed.
Right, but it's a new day, and I really think we're a spiritual group of people, just like everyone else, and I think we need to really be sensitive on that, and know the power of our spirituality and the power of our words. That we need to speak it differently. And if we keep saying that we don't, and we will not, and it has not been paid yet, then that's what we're creating, and that's what we're birthing out into the world. And depending on how much you believe what you just said, that's how soon you will see it manifested, if that makes sense. So I think we need to add all of that together in the presentation, which would be powerful. I'm just excited about, the time that we're living in, and that reparations is here. Are you excited, Marvin? Do you sense like this is the time, and we will see reparations distributed to the ADOS in America?
I truly feel momentum on the issue of reparations for the American descendants of slavery. It's a commonplace conversation where generally it was a fringe political issue. You hear it on the lips of politicians, you hear it on the lips of lobbyists, and you hear it on the bus stop, which is quite strange, but it's becoming a mainstream political issue. And even if you go back and look at some of the videos of Trump supporters storming the Capitol, one of the Trump supporters said that I don't feel like I should have to pay for slavery. And the fact that he said that as a reason for why he wanted to storm the Capitol was speaking to the fact that this issue is becoming mainstream. Yes.
Yeah, I believe that too. I've been hearing the words reparations, and we were talking about the demonstrations that's scheduled during the inauguration with the National Black Caucus and the Illinois Green Party. So, I think the timing is now, and I'm excited about that. Ali, is there anything you want to add?
Well, Mr. Marvin, you're a policy expert as well, I see. So how do you feel giving reparations contributes to healing of any of the issues that you've mentioned?
You can't put a dollar amount on healing, but you can put a dollar amount on the economic consequences that are associated with the sin of slavery. And I believe truly that both admitting that slavery was done, that it was wrong, in addition to Jim Crow, in addition to Jane Crow, in addition to years of police brutality, and the new Jim Crow, admitting that all of this was wrong and that African Americans weren't crazy to stand up and say, we are not valued in this country. All of those things have to go into play as well as the check. It's not just, we're gonna pay you and now you go away. It's recognizing the fact that all of these things have a disparate impact on the African American community that they don't have on our white counterparts. And not saying that to say that we hate white people or that, we feel as though, we want to enact anger or vengeance upon, white people who are born today who really didn't have anything to do with the original sin. But, the fact that you didn't have anything to do with the original sin, but are complicit in the sins that are currently going on is part of the problem. Okay.
So since we started our series, a few developments that are interesting have happened. We see a lot of divisiveness, more divisiveness right now, if anything, at the Capitol Hill. And then on top of that, I feel that maybe because of that, people would be more reluctant to be buying into the reparations issue. Then we have printing of money right now, which has devalued the US dollar to some degree. As a policy expert, I want you to comment on some of these issues. Because of that, we see, cryptocurrency taking a rise. So on top of that, we then have Mr. Bill Gates, who's gone ahead and bought a lot of land, farmland in the USA now. Do you think that these are now barriers that you will have to overcome in the giving of reparations, or how should we go about reparations in the light of the political climate that we're in?
Okay. I may not be able to speak exactly to some of the things that you mentioned, but I mean, we've always had the political obstacles that are in front of us today for reparations. There has never been a moment in our history when we've advocated for reparations and there wasn't, or that the political climate was right for us to advocate for reparations. So when people mention that, how are we going to advocate now that the political climate is, really difficult? Well, for African Americans, it's always been difficult. It's just now the rest of the country is starting to realize that it's difficult for them as well. That's the way that I would really respond to that. We can sit down and talk about financial methods for funding reparations and the fact that the dollar is weaker now, but it's still a debt that's owed. There are plenty of ways that we can actually go about making sure that the funding of reparations doesn't collapse the US dollar. I mean, we printed what, $2.5 trillion in the span of 2 or 3 months for COVID. And that was just for 1 year. Reparations doesn't all have to be paid at once. There are many things that we can do to make sure that we're able to compensate those who are originally harmed by the sin of slavery.
Okay, so please elaborate for us some of the ideas you have when it comes to money, the generation of money, or what you foresee as reparations. I mean, we've spoken to different speakers and they've given us a different vision. Senator Roland Burris believes that he wants to establish a corporation that would look into the investigation of reparations. And then having said that, looking at certain grants or other mechanisms by which reparations can take form. When it comes to Australia, they also do a similar model where they have a tribunal and a commission where a case is presented, and then it goes from there. They're either awarded based on land or money, etc. We continued on with different people and their ideas. I mean, you're the first one to talk about actual printing of money. I think Mr. James Cannon talked about a lottery idea. So if you could just go ahead and tell us what you foresee as a young student coming out of university that has thoroughly investigated, researched, and examined all sides of the coin.
So by every metric, we know that this is a multi-trillion-dollar debt. However, we know that that sum is not going to be paid out to every Black American. It would go specifically to the progeny of the victims of American chattel slavery and the oppression that followed. So Dr. Darity actually came up with, somewhat of a guide for eligibility. The first part of that is to say that an individual would have to provide reasonable documentation of at least one ancestor that was enslaved in the United States. And second, that they would need to demonstrate that they have identified as Black, African-American, colored, or Negro on established legal documents for at least 10 years prior to the onset of the program. There are people who are proponents of the ADOS movement who say that in addition, they would add that at least one grandparent has to fulfill both prongs of that criteria. When it comes to the implementation, in addition to large cash payments, the American descendants of slavery should also have policy items that include but shouldn't be limited to things like debt-free college, home ownership assistance, business financing support, fully endowing all HBCUs, guarantee government contracts for Black businesses, and free medical care. So we can start to kind of talk about what exactly the grand total for reparations would be. But we do understand that these items should be included in a federal reparations package. Regardless of how it's paid, this is a longstanding American debt. And once we actually address that, it can go a long way in cleansing our nation's soul. So when it comes to the funding of reparations as a federal program. We're looking at trying to close the racial wealth gap at the median level, which will require about 800,000 per ADOS. That can be in a multitude of different things. You can do bonds, you can do treasuries. We can do an initial capital injection, sort of like a capital bill, if you really wanted to. There are no limits to the way in which things can be funded. And we see that type of creativity when it comes to a lot of different other policies. I would like to see that same type of creativity used in trying to address the American descendants of slavery and their plight.
Okay. All right. So your thinking is pretty much in line with a lot of other speakers that have been before us in terms of just assistance in other forms, as well as not necessarily just monetary. And do you feel that people would be more welcoming to these proposals in a Biden-Harris administration?
No.
Good question.
Unfortunately, I do not believe that a Biden-Harris administration is any more welcoming to the idea of reparations than a Trump administration, unfortunately. And I think that is mainly because the idea of reparations isn't something that is widely popular in the Democratic Party, and it's not widely popular in the Republican Party. I think I alluded to it earlier when I said that in the African-American community, it's a widely popular policy proposal. But outside of the African-American community, it isn't a policy proposal that is widely popular. So in the party of the big tent, unfortunately, we probably don't have as many supporters as we would like to have, which is why we're trying to get out and make the argument for reparations now. We're trying to be loud and proud, and we're trying to make sure that we're framing this issue in a way that is both understandable for both the politicians, but also for their constituents.
Okay.
So what was the response when you submitted your legislation? I take it, I might be jumping the gun here. Have you tried to submit to your local Congress or House of Representative? And if so, what was their feedback?
So I haven't worked on federal reparations. I have been a proponent of HR 40 with the recommended edits by Dr. Sandy Darity. I do not have the information on hand, but I think that the amount of co-sponsors for HR 40 was the highest that it's been in recorded history, which is a great thing. The bill has been, reintroduced in the House for the better part of 30 or 35 years. So, that shows progress and momentum. But I wouldn't be able to tell you just how many co-sponsors actually signed on to the bill at this moment.
Okay. So tell us more about your HR 40 for those viewers that haven't necessarily been in touch with that proposal of yours.
So HR 40 is a commission to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. The bill establishes a commission to study and develop those proposals. The commission is supposed to examine slavery and discrimination in the colonies and in the United States from 1619 to the present and recommend appropriate remedies. Among other requirements, the commission shall identify the role of federal and state governments in supporting the institution of slavery, forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed slaves and their descendants, and lingering negative effects of slavery on living African Americans in society.
Okay.
It's a research.
So you know what I found interesting in all of this is that there's no human rights commission as it stands currently in the United States of America, and that was taken out in the Reagan era. Do you believe that there should be one?
I believe that there should be a federal department for research into issues that plague the American descendants of slavery. I'm wary to say that I would like a human rights commission and to try to link that with reparations, because what generally tends to happen is we'll end up prioritizing issues that affect larger swaths of people and not address the issue that affects the American descendants of slavery. And that's one thing that, you know, myself and many others in the movement are worried about.
Okay, Candace, you wanted to say something?
I was going back to the bill. The bill is for research. Is that it? Has it been funded?
It has not passed. So no, there's been no appropriated funding for it as of yet.
I was reading an article earlier this week that mentioned that the president-elect is going to revisit that bill. Did you hear about that?
I heard that the article that I read said that if President Biden was seeking to curry favor with the African American community, that he should consider broaching the topic of reparations. But I didn't hear anything from Biden's administration as far as actually attempting to tackle this issue.
Okay. Are you aware of the HR, Aaliyah, the James Cannon, it was HR
1242.
1242?
I am not familiar.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead, Aaliyah.
No, I'm basically good right now. My main thing is that I'd heard pretty much along the lines of what Candace was saying, that the Biden administration is now looking at reparations more seriously. And that article did broach the topic of HR 40 in that. So I'm wondering why they would look into that and then sort of hesitate at the same time. I know that there are demonstrations that are planned in favor of reparations in Capitol Hill, but whether or not that's going to escalate the situation or not is something that is on the mind of many. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I would have to say that, you know, full disclosure, I am a voting Democrat, but the thing about being a Democrat is also understanding that Democratic leadership is overwhelmingly white. Republican leadership is overwhelmingly white. And unfortunately, systems of white supremacy are things that they benefit from. So in order to, you know, protect your own position, you can say that you might take a look at reparations, but it doesn't mean that you have to be intentional about looking at reparations. Because to actually implement a federal reparations proposal will, you know, will change America in ways that nobody can imagine. It will, you know, put African Americans on equal footing with that of, you know, the white community for the first time in its history. And that is something that a lot of power players may not be a fan of. The fact that so many people are still able to benefit from the loss that African Americans, you know, continue to suffer from, whether it be through, you know, criminal justice and locking up African American brothers and sisters and how there are benefits in that, or African Americans going to college, taking out a lot of student loans, not being able to pay off those student loans because there aren't adequate job opportunities for African Americans after they graduate. These are all things that, you know, we have to take into consideration when we think about the political environment that we find ourselves in when pushing for reparations.
So what would you say to the constituents and the policy members that are going to be listening and watching this show? What would you say to them to connect with that fear that they have, that you just voiced, to kind of help them feel a little bit more comfortable with the concept?
Yeah, I mean, since 1619, this country has, you know, been built on the exploitation of land, labor, and resources. Post Bacon's Rebellion, there was no more solidarity between slaves and poor working whites and Native Americans. So, you know, the white bourgeoisie decided that they wanted to elevate the poor working class white people, just so that they would be just a little bit better than their African American brothers and sisters and their Native American brothers and sisters. And you know, that con is still going on today. When it comes time to truly think about being human and embracing humanity, we have to address the fact that so many of so many of American citizens who are minorities haven't been able to access a slice of the pie. And it's not that the pie isn't getting bigger. It's just that as it gets bigger, the people at the top are taking more and more. So if we really want to make sure that this society is as equitable as it can be, you know, addressing reparations for African Americans, finally putting them on equal footing and allowing this community to be somewhat autonomous, this is what we have to do. This is the most logical next step for making sure that this is in America that our children and our children's children can be proud of.
Nicely said. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your time, Marvin. We would love to, we're going to reach back out to you and maybe invite you back onto the show and follow up with you. And if there's anything that you need from us, the Green Party, we're also working vigorously in this cause. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Aaliyah. And we would love to collaborate with you going forward. I'm going to be thinking about this interview, as I think we can definitely collaborate with you really soon on authoring and maybe having it represented really soon to the administration.
Okay.
So, and if anything else comes up for you, feel free to reach out. I'm sure your mentor would be completely proud. And we're going to send a copy to him as well. So enjoy. Yeah, Aaliyah, yes.
Yeah, I definitely would ask you to reach out to the Green Party, maybe collaborate and come up with a draft legislation piece that we could present, because that's something we've been wanting to work on. In fact, right after this series is over. And then from there, we'd love to continue working with you just on other issues within Illinois. It's always great to be working with a policy expert. I myself ran in District 52 for state rep. Yeah. And so.
I would definitely recommend reaching back out to Dr. Darity, because he does, I think he has draft legislation already written up. It's basically HR 40, but it has like some much needed edits that he's written.
Okay, so I mean, the Green Party is on board and wanting to present something. So definitely this could be a collaborative effort.
Absolutely. So we will be in touch with you and Dr. Sandy Daughtery. And we look forward to working with you.
Yeah, and Candace is going to be here soon in Chicago as well. So we'll just, it's probably within a few weeks. So it won't be too long to go, and then we'll get started.
Okay.
Yeah, exciting times.
Very exciting times.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Okay, everyone, this is chapter 5. I need to do my closing of the collective sessions. The Illinois reparations chapter 5 with Marvin Slaughter, myself, Candace Pruden, aka Candace Carey, for those who have watched my movies, and Aaliyah Sarfraz. So tune in next week, same time, as we continue our discussion on reparations and also Chicago 52. Thank you. Take care. Stay well.